It's great to welcome Ben Newsome here today on the Dex Factor podcast. Ben is a talent and operating partner at Octopus Ventures, where he supports their portfolio companies across all things people and talent. Before that, Ben was responsible for product and data hiring at Monzo and Improbable. And in his past lives, Ben has been a founder and a pro golfer. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, buddy. Good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining. So to kick off, and I mentioned it earlier there in the intro, you've had a very interesting set of careers in your life. I think you're on career number 3, right? To help us understand the unique story behind your career, like what was your first job?
My first job was a professional golfer. A stark difference to what I do now, but ultimately, I guess the same working principles. Practice and try and get better. And I think now fast forwarding to where I'm now, I do take a lot from that. So yeah, I've been through 3 cycles now. So I have a deep empathy for finding the right thing, given I'm on my third strike.
How does one become a pro golfer as their first job? Like when did you start playing? Like how did that happen?
I have a dad that plays basically. It's not the most accessible sport, so I was lucky that my dad played and I got into it early and practiced a lot. And most importantly, I enjoyed it to sort of really grind out what was needed to sort of get to that level.
Amazing. And so tell us a little about your story from there. You went on to become a founder. Would love to hear in your own words a little bit about the twists and turns that you've been through that brought you to today.
Yeah, I think playing sport at a high level, it sort of takes you on a journey of wanting to constantly operate at that high level. And I think that's where I went into entrepreneurship. So the journey from pro golf was injury, bit of a cliche thing, but you have to land on your feet. And so I sort of fell into recruitment. I know a lot of people do say that, and I think that was the reality. I had to move quickly, and from there, it was just sort of how do I move into something that had a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more agency to really kind of push myself up, and that's where I kind of went into recruitment, sort of partnered up with one of my competitors initially, and then from there actually started my own tech business. So span out of sort of a recruitment business working with various tech founders to becoming one was a pretty extreme journey, as I'm sure you're experiencing right now, Paddy. And then from there, it was just make sure you're sort of working around people that are sort of pushing the needle and working on innovative things. So, and that's where I am now in venture capital. It really gives me that sort of muscle to flex when thinking about entrepreneurship, ambiguity, portfolio sort of pattern recognition. Everything is sort of nicely tied into where I am now.
What would you say if you had to think back would be the most pivotal moments in your career? Like, can you call one of those out for us? Like a time that you remember very vividly?
Well, the time I started my tech company was an interesting one because Reese, who was theoretically my business partner at the time, it was a situation where I just shut the laptop and said, I can't do anything else than think about this idea that I'm working on. I just can't look at my computer screen right now and do sort of business as usual recruitment. And it was that moment that sort of really was lucky actually, because when you're going into something that is so ambiguous and quite fearful in a way, you have to have this kind of motivation that's pushing you from the back. And that was this situation where it was almost I need to just separate myself and just dive headfirst in. Probably not the most pragmatic thing to do when, just going straight into starting a company, and you need to have that security and that sort of infrastructure to be able to move forwards into it comfortably. But nonetheless, it was the first time that I experienced this. Okay, you've got this opportunity. Your motivation is sky high now. You'd rather go bankrupt trying to start something than continue doing what you're doing.
That's awesome. Thinking about the future now, if we were going to meet up for a coffee or 50 years from now, what do you want to look back?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I think the sort of stepping stones of learning. When I think about you and I, Paddy, when we met a long, long time ago and worked together, you learn about somebody's personality, somebody's curiosities, somebody's strengths, and then when you sort of fast forward, you go, have they sort of been fulfilled? What was the impact that that person had on me and the world? And more importantly, in this situation, what they were trying to do and solve for. So I think 50 years from now, we would have said, look, we've both had some pretty big ideas. What have we managed to achieve? and who have we impacted? And I'd like to think that there should be a couple of good stories in there from 50 years time.
I'd hope so. Awesome. Kind of jumping in a little bit now. Obviously, you've been involved in recruitment for a long time. You've recruited lots of people. Is there one that stands out to you? Maybe a favorite hire or a most memorable?
Um, I mean, there's plenty that have sort of different reasons, but I think maybe going back to my time at Improbable was a bit of a kind of I guess, an inflection point in how to do recruitment for me. Stepping in with the likes of you and Aaron and Adrian and the team there, it was kind of how can we innovate on how we recruit? And I think that was the time where I was working on recruiting engineers that were really, really high bar. And how we look at sort of early founding engineer in sort of AI right now, it was kind of how we were looking at it at Improbable. And I made a hire, which was a principal engineer. And I think there were a couple of reasons that was one of my favorite hires. One was because historically inside of Improbable, it was always promote from within. And so senior engineers would sort of take that principal title. And at the time, that wasn't really a sort of job realm inside of Improbable. It was something that wasn't created yet. What does principal engineering mean? Is it a new sort of organization? How does that sort of level operate? And so that was a big challenge to sort of get the business aligned in that breadth and depth in sort of a principal title. And then secondly, actually, I was really proud in that the first hire we made, because of all that upfront work, we made a hire really quickly. And one of the sort of philosophies that I live by is that if you do enough of the upfront work and you get really aligned, every single stakeholder in that process in the hiring squad gets aligned, you should be able to make the hire quickly if you go straight to a person that fits. And, you remove all of those operational, that time cost that comes along with it, and you make it quickly. And that happened in this role. So given the complexity of the hire, the fact that it was a new organization, coupled with the speed to hire, it was something that I remember. And actually, when I get asked this question, I do call upon that example.
Yeah. Nice. I remember that time. That was it was a particularly difficult one because, as you say, what that meant wasn't clear to everybody. And so I remember lots of meetings where there was, what do we even mean by this? What is it for? And I remember all the work that went into it. So yeah, no, a great story. In your experience, what's the difference between a good and a great hire?
I think, to be succinct, a good hire does a good job, does the job that you're hiring for. I think an excellent hire is a force multiplier. So I think when you think about an individual's job, if you think about cascading OKRs, it ends up down at an individual level. That person has objectives to deliver. I think a really good hire improves the OKRs from bottom up. So the team improves, revenue improves, delivery speed improves, product quality improves, stickiness of that product improves. And that really is kind of how I would determine a great hire. You'd like to think every good hire aligns with the behaviors and in turn the values that you set as a founder. But in reality, actually, somebody that is great can really help you influence those or change them and challenge you on them by seeing that improvement. You're almost hiring somebody that was better than you thought in that, and it sort of reframes your view on that particular function or job role.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We had Sim on a few weeks ago, and she said that a good hire sort of does the job that you ask them to do. A great hire sort of makes you think that the job was much bigger than makes you realize the job was much bigger than you thought. Brings you things that you didn't even know were possible, and I think that's really true. And I think about the great hires that I've seen influence a business. It is they influence the business.
Absolutely.
It's actually things change around them. Whatever sort of scale that may be, and I think that scale is depending on how great they are, it can be at a team level, it could be on a department level, or it could even be a whole organization. Going back to kind of, more about some of the experiences, some of the more challenging roles. Obviously that principal engineer role was very challenging, but what would you say is the most challenging role you've ever worked on?
So a lot of the time, the most challenging roles are the executive roles that I work, and especially when working with a founder that is effectively handing over something that they're currently owning. And one I remember really clearly is there was a company called Receipt Bank. It's now Dext, following acquisition, and it was for a chief product officer role. And at the time, the CEO was effectively at a certain scale where he had to hand over a certain level of that responsibility. So very naturally, there was a challenge in actually helping the CEO transition away from it, which is a big enough job in itself. As you know, as businesses go through scale, there is a kind of a reorganization of the structure in the executive function, even up into board level, who is responsible for making the decisions around what. I think in hindsight, a lot of the challenge I had was not only helping them hand over to somebody else, but actually building a process whereby I can remove that person's biases and challenges throughout. And what I really struggle with, and this wasn't from an internal recruiter seat, this was actually while I was still working in agency. And so I didn't have the ability to influence and I guess facilitate the right kind of discussions between the interviewing squad, i.e. the interviewers, and the key hiring manager, which was the CEO. And so a lot of the time I'll just be getting up to final stage, final offer, and it will bounce out. And I was kind of going back to the drawing board, and the CEO would sort of make biased opinions. And it took a 6-month process to sort of get to a conclusion. And I think now, actually, funny enough, when I think about that, it kind of goes back to my philosophy of get ultra alignment up front, and then you remove those biases and that sort of those tendencies to, I guess, veto or sort of sabotage a process when you're a hiring manager. So when it doesn't matter if it's small or big, a hard hire is something that you don't prepare for, and this one, in hindsight, was something that I could have prepared better for.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always think, when a hire is difficult, sometimes it's because it's a difficult skill. Sometimes it's because maybe you're not paying a competitive amount, but most of the time it's because you don't know what you want. And that's one of the reasons that I went and took on a broader role in people when I left sort of pure talent acquisition, because honestly I realized that so much of the problems we were having to solve down in talent were sort of set at that organizational layer where roles were being defined without actually the objectives or the mission of that role, or whatever you want to call it. The actual clarity on what we're trying to do wasn't there. And so yeah, really interesting to see that you've seen that too. We've all made hires that haven't worked out. When you've seen that happen before, or when you've seen somebody that's you may be struggling in role, what are the similar patterns? What are the warning signs for you?
I think the whys. I'm always thinking about the why. Why are you there? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you working for this particular business? Why do you believe that mission is something that means enough to you to really want to push yourself, be motivated, be that sort of bar raiser inside of the business? So for me, I think that when I'm sort of coaching founders early, it's work with the candidates and think about that in a sort of a job description, in the way that your narrative comes across, in the way you train your interviewers to sort of get across what is in it for those candidates. You need to help them understand the why they're there, because I think when, from my experience, and I think anybody's experience, inside of a role, fulfillment and enjoyment comes from understanding that what you're doing is something that you have some passion for. So helping people that understand that is
I think like when you're giving advice, I mean, I'm sure that you get this all the time. People kind of call you up and ask you for advice about a job they're considering or an offer that they've received. What kind of advice do you give to people in that situation?
Yeah, I think there's a few things really. Again, the whys. I think that's really important. I think there's also an element of, have you taken the time to really kind of inspect this particular role, this company, understand where you are in life. Is it something that's more reactive than actually proactively working on yourself, being true to what it is that you want to do? And I think, Paddy, from conversations we've had about Dex, I think one of the key things I see about recruitment going forwards is that there is more opportunity out there than one sees. Don't be reactive to taking a job offer just because it's something that you need immediately, or obviously there are edge cases. In fact, in many cases, you have to work at speed because you might need a job to land quite quickly, an opportunity for you to really explore and find something that means more to you. And then with that in mind, be really sort of candid with the people that you're speaking to about what it is you want. Be upfront. Make sure that you're aligned on what is expected in the role and what you can receive from it. I think especially when we were at Improbable, Paddy, we always had this philosophy of write a job ad with the kind of language in what is in it for them. You can come and achieve this. When you deliver that, you will achieve this. And that's what really kind of what I want candidates to think about most of the time. It's not, don't change the fabric of yourself to sort of fit a business just for the sake of a job. Really be true and be upfront about what it is you like to do, how you like to work, and how that can make an impact on the business. And then when you're obviously in seat, as you go through the months, the years, you'll find fulfillment more easily. You'll understand why you're working towards that mission.
Yeah, no, it's true. I find it interesting because it's always, it's something I've always done myself, but where you spend your time is the biggest investment you can make. It's the only thing you can't get back. You can replace money, you can replace things, you can do all that stuff, but the time that you spend is irreplaceable. And so I really do find it just so jarring when you see people that will just accept the first offer they receive, or when they twist and contort themselves to be what the hiring manager is looking for, when actually deep down they know that's not a great fit.
Absolutely.
And look, we've all got bills to pay, we've all got pressures and all the rest of it, and and sometimes it doesn't feel like you have the chance to really see the options that you want. But I think that was where you have to reflect, and as an individual, you have to sort of know, okay, these are the things that matter to me. These are
Yeah.
the things that I care about. I want to work in a place like this. I don't want to work in a place like that. And I just think that it's something that so few people do.
Yeah, and I think if you were to sort of double click on it more, there's one of the key things I always hear from, unfortunately in the VC world, we had 2022, 2023, where there were a bunch of redundancies, and I spent a lot of time speaking to people that were leaving businesses. And one of the key things that came out was the narrative around progression. Where can you go within a business? What can you achieve? Even to sort of internal mobility. So be be upfront when thinking about the next job, understanding where you can go and get within that. And in some cases, that's with big corporates. There can be a ceiling. There might not be. Specific teams might have it. Even your manager's philosophy around progression could determine your happiness in a year's time.
Yeah, 100%. What do you wish that hiring managers knew about recruitment?
Hiring is one of the highest leverage things that a hiring manager can do. Absolutely, no doubt. But I just wish sometimes they realize that the operational cost of trying to own it yourself can be extreme. And most cases, when you have a day job to do alongside the recruiting, the quality of both can drop drastically to the point where a lot of the time both can fail. So make sure you get people around you, especially recruiters where possible, that are there to support you and build the infrastructure for hiring efficiently and at high velocity, but more importantly, at high quality. I think there's a lot of hiring managers and especially founders that sort of adopt it themselves, go to market and try and own everything themselves, and just do it sort of pretty badly because of time constraints and capacity constraints. So, take the time up front to think about the capacity management of this process, bring in people around you, delegate roles to do with the process that is going to raise the bar, and then execute on that as efficiently as possible. And obviously, with recruiters there, make sure that you're aligned with them to the point where they can really adopt most of the sort of cumbersome process and facilitate a good process, whereby you are just there for main key decision making, not the operational decision making. So that's one thing.
It's interesting. I think that hiring managers, yeah, I think it's funny, right? A lot of hiring managers you meet, they kind of get this impression that recruitment's easy, or that it's something they can do. And I liken it a bit like, I like to think I could be a good chef because I've eaten in a restaurant.
Yeah.
And the reality is recruitment is a very, very specific set of skills. And as a hiring manager, your job is not to do recruitment. Like your job is to hire a great individual, and in the same way that, if you're a product leader, your job is to build a great product. It's not necessary to do graphic design.
Mm.
And so, I think that hiring managers, I think there's an element there of respecting the craft and understanding what it is. It is one of the most complex sales processes that you can imagine, because you're dealing with, what I call a two-sided buy and sell. There are very few two-sided buy and sells in the world. The only other one that I can really think of is the investing process. And so I think actually investing and recruitment have got a lot more in common than, say, recruitment and sales. And I think that's one of the big mistakes that people make when they think about recruitment. They think of recruitment as a sales process, where you need a funnel and you need, all these kinds of things. I actually think it's a bit of a misnomer. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think that the one similarity with the sales process is the retention and expansion piece of a sales funnel. If you think about sales as a bow tie, you acquire customers, you commit, and then you retain and expand on that customer. And that's where most revenue comes from in technology businesses, especially B2B businesses. I think about recruitment as the same. You have a responsibility that once you get hiring sorted, you land a hire, the work is there to really build on. You have to help that individual expand. You have to be a good manager and help them navigate the journey through the company, especially within that first year, up through into areas where they can really show their strengths. And that's where you extract this kind of high performer, bar raiser mentality as you work with them on what they need to grow and what they want to do to grow.
Yeah, that's a nice insight. What do you wish candidates knew about recruitment?
I think that candidates, there's more to a company than meets the eye. I think there's a lot of candidates I speak to that have an offer from a big brand name, and that's one big fat checklist off, and they would accept the offer. But again, sort of going back to sort of aforementioned, there is a lot to particular businesses. Some are incredibly bureaucratic, some are very political, some are very kind of highly autonomous, and so think about the way in which you operate, what it is that you want from a particular role, a company, and be a little bit more pragmatic around the decision making. Be honest with yourself, I think, and that's the key. Outside of that, there is like we've spoken about in the past, Paddy, there is a lot of opportunity to build a profile and sell yourself into companies. You don't just have to take the jobs that are on LinkedIn. There you can be more thoughtful in the ways in which you go about selling yourself to companies, especially with the likes of AI now. You can really build a solid sort of candidate value proposition and think deeply about the companies that you will align with, and go and reach out and use creative techniques to sort of get in front of those hiring managers. And most of the time, those are the hires that are the most successful. And every hiring manager will say people that come through their network, people that come through highly regarded referrals, and then people that come with a great story, they land, and you have a basis as to why you're going to collaborate well. I think it just means more.
That's awesome. Ben, thank you so much for sitting down with us today and taking us through all of that. It's been great to learn a bit more about your experience and what you've been up to. And we can't wait to have you back on the next time.
Thanks, Paddy. I appreciate you. Have a great one. Always good to catch up.
Thanks.